The air inside the William Barret tobacco factory was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from the humid breath of the James River and the acrid, stinging dust of cured tobacco leaves. It was 1848 in Richmond, Virginia, and the industrial heart of the Upper South beat not to the rhythm of the seasons, but to the relentless thrum of the screw press and the steam engine. Here, the institution of slavery had mutated into an industrial machine, distinct from the sprawling silence of the cotton fields further south. The Richmond manufactories were loud, crowded, and relentless ecosystems of production where the golden leaf was processed into the plug and twist tobacco that fueled the region's economy. Henry Brown stood at his station, his hands moving with the practiced, almost autonomous dexterity of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades mastering a task he despised. Born into enslavement in Louisa County around 1815, Henry had been brought to Richmond as a youth, separated from his parents and siblings, a trauma that served as the foundational crack in his world, one he had plastered over with hard work and a stoic demeanor. In the factory, he was not merely a laborer, he was a valuable asset, a man known for his reliability and skill. This perceived value was a double-edged blade. It granted him certain privileges, immunity from the whip, typically, and the ability to earn modest sums through the overwork system, where enslaved men were paid for production exceeding their daily quotas. But it also bound him tighter to the city and his owner. William Barret, the factory owner, viewed Henry not as a man but as a high-functioning component of his profitable enterprise, a machine that required maintenance in the form of occasional new suits of clothes or pocket money, but never freedom. The factory environment was a unique and harrowing sensory experience. While the popular imagination often places enslaved people solely in agricultural settings, Richmond was an industrial metropolis, the Pittsburgh of the South in the making. Thousands of enslaved men labored in the ironworks of Tredegar and the tobacco rows of Shockoe Bottom. They lived in a state of quasi-independence compared to plantation hands, often hiring themselves out or living in rented quarters, yet they were under constant surveillance. The city's architecture itself was a cage. The slave jails of Robert Lumpkin and Silas Omohundro stood as grim sentinels in Shockoe Bottom, reminding every man in the factories that they were only one sail away from the sugarcane fields of Louisiana or the cotton bottoms of Mississippi. The dust in the factory was ubiquitous, coating the skin and filling the lungs, a constant reminder of the crop that dictated their lives. The noise was a cacophony of shouting overseers, the creak of wooden presses, and the shuffling of hundreds of feet. Henry's life in 1848 was a precarious balance of labor and domesticity. He had utilized the small liberties afforded to him to construct a semblance of a life. He was a member of the First African Baptist Church, singing in the choir, his voice rising above the noise of his station. More importantly, he had a family. He had married Nancy, a woman enslaved by a bank clerk named Mr. Lee. Their union, though not recognized by the laws of Virginia, was sanctified by their commitment and the community that surrounded them. They had 3 children, and Nancy was pregnant with a 4th. Henry had rented a small house for them, paying for it with his overwork earnings. It was a domestic island in a sea of uncertainty. He would leave the choking dust of the factory in the evenings and return to this home, a space that felt almost free. However, the tectonic plates of the domestic trade were shifting. The demand for labor in the Deep South was insatiable, and Virginia was the primary supplier. The state exported thousands of souls annually. Every enslaved person in Richmond lived with the low-level hum of anxiety that they or their loved ones could be converted into liquid capital at a moment's notice. Henry believed he had insulated himself from this terror. He had extracted promises. Mr. Lee had assured him that Nancy would never be sold. Henry's own master, Barret, had no reason to sell his best worker, but promises in Richmond were written in smoke. The economic pressures on slaveholders or simply their capricious whims often overrode their verbal assurances. In the factory, rumors flew faster than tobacco dust. A man missing from his bench one morning might be in the slave jail by noon and on a steamer to New Orleans by sunset. Henry worked through the summer of 1848 with a growing unease, the heat of the season matching the rising temperature of his anxiety. The betrayal did not happen with a shout. It happened with a silence that screamed. Henry Brown had been at his work in the factory for only a few hours that August morning when the news was delivered to him, not by his master, but by the grapevine of the enslaved community. Nancy and the children had been sold. The transaction had been swift and secretive. Mr. Lee, the man who had promised faithfully never to separate the family, had sold Nancy to a Methodist minister from North Carolina who was passing through town purchasing stock. The sheer banality of the act was suffocating. A man of purported high moral standing purchasing a pregnant woman and her children as an investment, while her husband stood a few miles away, pressing tobacco to make the money he had hoped would secure their safety. Henry rushed from the factory, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He went to his master, William Barret, tears streaming down his face, a breach of the stoic mask he had worn for years. He begged Barret to intervene, to use his influence, to buy Nancy and the children himself so they could remain in Richmond. Barrett's response was cold, practical, and devastatingly dismissive. "You can get another wife." It was a sentence that encapsulated the entire dehumanizing philosophy of the era. To Barret, Nancy was interchangeable, a unit of production. To Henry, she was his world. The realization that he was powerless, despite his money, his skills, his good behavior, broke something fundamental in Henry. He rushed to the location where the coffle was assembling. In Richmond, the geography of sorrow was concentrated in Shockoe Bottom, near the jails of Lumpkin and Omohundro. It was here that the groups were formed before being marched to the train station or the docks. He found them. Nancy and the 3 children were already part of a coffle, a group of 350 enslaved people gathered for transport. The scene was a chaotic tableau of misery. Chains rattled as men were secured in pairs. Women stood weeping, clutching bundles of meager possessions. Children looked around with wide, confused eyes. The air was thick with the sounds of wailing and the harsh commands of the drivers. Henry approached the line. He could not take them out. He could not fight the armed guards. He could only stand witness. Nancy saw him. She did not scream. The depth of her despair had moved beyond sound. She simply looked at him, her hands holding their children close, her pregnant form a silent testament to the future that was being stolen from them. They were not allowed a private goodbye. The intimacy of their marriage was violated by the public nature of their separation. He took her hand through the imaginary barrier that the traders had erected, a touch that had to convey a lifetime of apology and love in a fleeting second. The order to move was given. The drivers cracked their whips, not necessarily to strike but to signal the start of the march. The coffle began to heave forward, a slow-moving organism of grief. Henry walked alongside them for as long as he could. The procession moved through the streets of Richmond, streets Henry had walked 1,000 times as a man of the city, which now looked like the corridors of a prison. He watched his children. The eldest looked back at him, a silent question on his face that Henry could not answer. Why? Why can't you stop this? The question burned into Henry's soul, branding him with a shame that was not his to carry but which he bore nonetheless. He walked with them until the coffle reached the point where he could go no further. He stopped. The line continued. He watched the back of Nancy's head, the slump of her shoulders. He memorized the shape of her, the way she walked, the color of her head wrap. He was trying to imprint them onto his retina, knowing that once they turned the corner, they would exist only in the agonizing realm of memory. The sun beat down on the dusty road. The noise of the city continued. The carts, the shouts of merchants, the distant factory whistles. The world had not ended, and that was the cruelest part. The birds still sang. The river still flowed. But Henry's universe was receding from him, step by shackled step. He stood there, a solitary figure in the bustling street, his hands empty, his heart hollowed out. The distance between them grew. 10 yards, 20 yards, 50 yards. The dust, kicked up by the hundreds of feet, obscured them, turning his family into ghosts before they were even gone. He did not move. He could not. To turn back toward the factory was to accept the reality of his solitude. To move forward was to risk death without purpose. So he stood in the suspension of that terrible moment, the visual tether stretching, until it snapped into the void. The silence of the road left Henry Brown with nothing but the echo of his own heartbeat, a rhythm that would soon drive him toward a desperate and unprecedented plan. Henry Brown returned to the house he had rented for his family, but it was no longer a home. It was a mausoleum of silence. For months he moved through his life like a sleepwalker. The grief was a physical weight, a torture of the heart and soul that exceeded any physical pain. But as the autumn of 1848 turned into the winter of 1849, the paralysis of sorrow began to harden into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. He would not take another wife. He would not remain a cog in the machine that had devoured his family. If he could not be a husband or a father, he would be a free man. The idea did not come from a book or a conversation. It arrived, as Henry would later recount, as a sudden inspiration. He was contemplating his situation when the thought struck his mind, clear and imperative. Go and get a box and put yourself in it. It was an absurd, terrifying, and brilliant notion. The traditional methods of escape usually involved running, hiding in swamps, following the North Star, moving under the cover of darkness. Henry's plan was different. He would not run. He would be shipped. He would transform himself from a fugitive into a package of dry goods. To execute such an audacious plan, Henry needed accomplices. He could not build the box himself without raising suspicion, nor could he mail himself. He turned to the choir of the First African Baptist Church, a place where trust was forged in song. He confided in James Caesar Anthony Smith, James C.A. Smith, a free black man who was a dentist and a shopkeeper. James was intelligent, literate, and deeply committed to the cause, but he knew they needed a white man to handle the logistics of shipping a package through Adams Express without inspection. They found their third conspirator in Samuel Alexander Smith, Samuel A. Smith, a white shoemaker and a man of complicated morals. Samuel was a gambler, a man who lived on the margins of Richmond's respectability, and he himself owned enslaved people. He was not a purely altruistic abolitionist. He was a pragmatist who needed money. Henry offered him his savings, $86, a significant sum, equivalent to over $3,000 in modern currency. Samuel agreed. It was a transaction, but one that bound their fates together. The trio began their work in secret. They consulted a carpenter to build the crate. It had to be innocuous, looking like a standard shipment of dry goods, yet capable of concealing a full-grown man. The dimensions were meticulously calculated: 3 feet long, 2 feet 8 inches deep, and 2 feet wide. It was a coffin-sized space, barely large enough for Henry, who was 5 feet 8 inches and weighed 200 pounds. The carpenter, unaware of the cargo, lined it with baize, a coarse woolen fabric, perhaps thinking it was for fragile goods. They drilled 3 small gimlet holes for air, tiny, imperceptible punctures that would be Henry's only link to the atmosphere of the living. They prepared the markings. This side up with care. A cruel irony, as they knew the illiterate handlers of the freight system would likely ignore it. The date was set for March 23, 1849. But Henry had one final hurdle: the factory. He could not simply vanish. He needed an excuse for his absence to buy time before the alarm was raised. On the morning of his departure, Henry performed an act of self-mutilation that demonstrated the terrifying depth of his commitment. He took oil of vitriol, sulfuric acid, and poured it onto his own hand. The acid sizzled, eating into the skin and down to the bone. The pain was blinding, a white-hot shock that nearly dropped him to his knees. But he did not scream. He wrapped the hand. When he showed it to the overseer at the factory, the man, sickened by the sight of the raw, chemical burn, told him to go home and recover. Henry had bought his window of time with his own flesh. He went to the house of James C.A. Smith. Samuel A. Smith was there. The box waited. It was a wooden womb and a wooden tomb. Henry had provisions, a bladder of water and a few biscuits. He dressed in his normal clothes. He stepped into the box. He had to curl his body into a fetal position, his knees pressed against his chest, his injured hand throbbing in the darkness. As the lid was positioned over him, Henry Brown prepared to trade the known hell of Richmond for the unknown terrors of the dark, confined passage to Philadelphia. The lid was placed over him. The darkness was absolute. Then came the sound of the hammer. Thud, thud, thud. Each nail driven in was a seal on his fate. He was no longer Henry Brown, a man. He was a crate. He was cargo. He was a package addressed to William H. Johnson, Arch Street, Philadelphia, a code name for the abolitionist office. Samuel A. Smith arranged for the box to be collected by the Adams Express Company wagon. As the wagon rumbled away, Henry lay in the dark, the smell of baize and sawdust filling his nose, the pain in his hand a rhythmic pulse. He was leaving Richmond, not on his feet, but in a pine box, mailing himself into the teeth of the American shipping industry. The journey of the box was a 27-hour descent into a physical and psychological trial. As the Adams Express wagon trundled over the cobblestones of Richmond toward the train depot, Henry was jostled violently, his body slamming against the wooden walls. The box was 3 feet long, he was 5 feet 8. He could not stretch. He could not shift his weight. He was folded into a space that defied anatomy. At the depot, the box was unloaded. Henry held his breath. If he coughed, if he sneezed, if he groaned from the pain in his acid-burned hand, it would be over. He heard the voices of the baggage handlers, rough men discussing the weight of the crate. "Heavy one," someone grunted. Then the first disaster. Despite the bold, "This side up" lettering, the box was flipped. Henry was upside down. Blood rushed to his head, his temples pounded. The pressure in his eyes became unbearable, as if they would burst from their sockets. His neck, bent at an awkward angle, felt as though it would snap. For miles, as the train clattered north, he remained inverted. His brain screamed for oxygen. His veins felt like they were filled with molten lead. He began to lose consciousness, the darkness of the box merging with the blackness of fainting. He focused his mind, fighting the panic. He told himself that death in the box was better than life in the factory. Just as he felt he was slipping into a fatal coma, the box was moved again, likely at the transfer point at Aquia Creek. He was righted. The blood drained from his head, leaving him dizzy and nauseous, but alive. He gasped for air through the gimlet holes, sipping the stale atmosphere of the freight car. The journey was a relay race of transportation modes, each bringing a fresh terror. From the train, the box was transferred to a steamboat on the Potomac River. Here, the box was placed on the deck. Henry could hear the water, the churn of the paddle wheel, the voices of passengers. Some travelers even sat on the box, using it as a bench. He heard them talking about the institution of slavery, discussing the very laws and practices he was escaping. He lay inches beneath them, a silent rebuttal to their arguments. One man kicked the box and remarked on its weight, speculating it might contain mail. Henry lay frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The transfer to Washington, D.C., and then to the train for Philadelphia involved more rough handling. He was thrown onto wagons, slid across floors. The biscuit and water he had brought were almost impossible to consume. His position was too cramped to lift his hand to his mouth easily. The pain in his burned hand was a constant, throbbing bass note to the acute agony of his cramped muscles. His legs went numb, then burned with the return of circulation, then went numb again. He drifted into a hallucinatory state, The boundary between his body and the wood seemed to dissolve. He was the box. The darkness was timeless. He did not know if it was day or night. He only knew the vibration of the train, the whistle of the steam engine, the sound of the north drawing closer. Crossing the Mason-Dixon line was invisible in the dark. There was no fanfare, only the continued rattle of the rails. But the atmosphere changed. The voices outside became different accents, different urgency. He was in a free state, but he was still a prisoner in his crate. The motion finally ceased, leaving Henry in a silence that was either the stillness of freedom or the quiet of a jail cell, waiting for the prying of the lid to reveal his fate. The silence in the room at the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society office was thick with tension. 4 men stood around the crate: James Miller McKim, the head of the office; William Still, the clerk and future historian of the Underground Railroad; Professor C.D. Cleveland; and Lewis Thompson. They had received the telegram from Samuel Smith. They knew who was supposed to be inside, but the box sat there, mute and still as a coffin. McKim rapped on the lid. "All right?" he asked, his voice trembling. From the depths of the wood, a muffled, weary voice replied, "All right." The relief in the room was explosive. They grabbed tools, a saw and a hatchet, and began to pry off the hickory hoops and the nailed lid. Wood splintered. The nails groaned as they were forced out. Finally, the lid was lifted. Henry Brown did not scramble out. He rose slowly, unfolding his cramped limbs like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis. He was drenched in sweat, haggard, his hand bandaged and bloody, but he stood upright. He looked at the men, smiled, and extended a hand. "How do you do, gentlemen?" he said. It was a moment of theatrical perfection, and Henry knew it. He didn't just collapse, he performed. He immediately broke into a song, a hymn of thanksgiving he had selected for this very moment. "I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry." It was the birth of Henry Box Brown. His arrival was a sensation. The abolitionist community hailed him as a hero. He was a living symbol of the ingenuity and humanity of the enslaved. He adopted the middle name Box as a badge of honor. But Henry was not content to be merely a symbol. He was an artist. He realized that his story had power, and that power could be monetized and weaponized against the system he had escaped. He teamed up with Charles Stearns to publish his narrative of the life of Henry Box Brown. But Henry wanted more visual impact. He commissioned a moving panorama, a massive scroll of canvas, hundreds of yards long, painted with scenes of his life and escape. This was the mirror of slavery. Henry would stand on stage while the scroll unwound, narrating his journey, and at the climax he would climb into the original box, or a replica, and jump out, reenacting his resurrection night after night. However, the ecosystem of freedom was fragile. The passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850 changed everything. The law allowed slave catchers to seize fugitives in free states with federal assistance. Henry, a high-profile escapee who was publicly mocking the institution, was a prime target. In Providence, he was assaulted on the street, a warning shot. Realizing that the North was no longer safe, Henry looked across the Atlantic. In October 1850, he boarded a ship for England. He took his panorama, his box, and his story, leaving the United States behind. His accomplices back in Richmond faced a darker fate. Samuel A. Smith, the gambler who nailed the box shut, attempted the trick again. In 1849, he tried to ship 2 more enslaved men, but the plan was discovered, likely through a betrayal or intercepted message. He was arrested and sentenced to years in the Virginia penitentiary. James C.A. Smith, the faithful choir member, also fled to the north to avoid arrest, eventually joining Henry in New England before they had a falling out over financial matters and the philosophy of their partnership. Safe in England but exiled from his homeland, Henry Brown began a second life that would take him far from the abolitionist podiums and into the realm of pure spectacle. Decades later, in a comfortable home in Toronto, an old man lay dying. It was June 1897. Henry Box Brown was over 80 years old. The dust of the Richmond factory was a half-century gone, washed away by the rains of London and the snows of Canada. But the thread that had snapped that day in Richmond, the sight of Nancy and the children disappearing into the dust of the coffle, had never truly been tied back together. Previously, Henry was standing in the road, watching his life dissolve. He never saw Nancy again. He never saw those 3 children again. That loss was a wound that healed over but left a scar that defined the topography of his soul. In the years after his escape, critics like Frederick Douglass had chastised Henry for being too public, for telling the secrets of the escape and ruining the method for others. But Douglass had his freedom and his family. Henry had only his box. Henry's response to the loss of his first family was a frantic, creative reinvention. In England, he didn't just speak, he became a showman. He realized that the British public grew tired of simple, sad stories. They wanted spectacle. So, the man who had been a piece of cargo became the African prince. He dressed in exotic, colorful robes, wore jewelry, and performed magic tricks. He became a mesmerist, a hypnotist. He cast spells on audiences, perhaps trying to exert the control over the world that he had lacked on that helpless morning in Richmond. He remarried. In 1855, he wed Jane Floyd, a white Cornish woman, a tin worker's daughter. It was a radical act, an interracial marriage in Victorian England. They had children. He built a new family, a resurrection. Family, constructed on the soil of freedom. They toured together as the Brown Family Jubilee Singers, performing and surviving. The narrative of Henry Box Brown remains a testament to the lengths the human spirit will go to secure its own agency. From the dust of the tobacco factory to the stage lights of England, his life was a performance of freedom, enacted against the longest of odds.